Elias Thorne, a former torpedoman on a WWII-class submarine, presses his calloused thumb against a water-stained Ace of Spades recovered from a 1944 Sea of Japan patrol. His fingernail catches on a brittle, yellowed corner of the cardstock where salt marks have crystallized into a white crust. A single sphere of water detaches from the chrome faucet nozzle and strikes the bottom of the porcelain sink with a sharp, echoing snap. Thorne flinches at the sound, causing his metal wristwatch to clatter against the hard surface of the Formica kitchen table. He shifts his weight on the vinyl seat of the chair, which emits a low-frequency groan from the stressed wooden frame. The Howard Miller wall clock releases a heavy mechanical tock as the brass pendulum reaches the apex of its arc. Thorne inhales. The clock ticks. Thorne exhales. The clock ticks again. He reaches out with a trembling hand to cover the Ace of Spades, hiding the salt-damaged surface from the overhead fluorescent light. The fluorescent bulb flickers once, casting a momentary shadow across the linoleum floor and the base of the kitchen cabinets. Thorne stands up, pushing the wooden chair back until the legs bite into the floor with a harsh grating noise. His boots strike the linoleum as he moves toward the sink to grasp the cold metal of the faucet's compression valve handle. He applies downward pressure to the handle, tightening the internal rubber washer until the water flow ceases completely. In October 1944, torpedoman Elias Thorne boards the WWII-class submarine USS Harder for a Sea of Japan patrol to conduct commerce raiding operations against Japanese shipping. Thorne kneels on the steel deck plating of the forward torpedo room to begin a routine maintenance check on a Mark 14 torpedo stored in rack number 2. He uses a heavy steel wrench to loosen the guide bolt on the torpedo's gyro setting mechanism, ensuring the weapon will track accurately during deployment. Thorne wipes excess grease from the Mark 14's contact pistol using a ragged piece of oil-soaked burlap. The chief of the boat, Senior Chief Miller, steps over the high threshold of the forward bulkhead door into the torpedo compartment. Miller places a deck of bicycle playing cards onto the flat surface of the torpedo tube number 3 outer door. Thorne grips the cold steel of the Mark 14's bronze propeller blades to check for any obstruction in the drivetrain. A voice crackles over the 1MC general announcing system, ordering the crew to general quarters for an immediate dive. Thorne secures the wrench into the tool locker and slides the heavy steel latch into the locked position. The WWII-class submarine tilts forward at a 10-degree down angle as the main ballast tanks vent air through the open flood valves. Thorne braces his boots against the non-skid deck plating to maintain his balance during the rapid descent to 100 feet. He observes the needle on the depth gauge rotate clockwise past the 150-foot mark on the dial. The pressure hull of the forward torpedo room produces a sustained, high-frequency metal strain under the increasing external water pressure. Miller leans against the Mark 14 torpedo rack and pulls the Ace of Spades from the deck of cards to inspect the print. A muffled explosion from a Japanese Type 95 depth charge vibrates through the surrounding seawater and strikes the submarine's pressure hull. The impact causes the overhead light bulbs to shatter, showering the forward torpedo room with glass shards. Thorne reaches for the emergency battle lantern mounted to the port side bulkhead, but the mounting bracket shears off the wall. The WWII-class submarine's vibration stops momentarily before a second. Closer explosion tosses Thorne against the breech handle of torpedo tube number 1. A seam in the overhead freshwater piping ruptures, spraying a high-pressure stream of liquid onto the electrical control panel. Sparks erupt from the short-circuiting wires, illuminating the compartment in brief, white rhythmic flashes. Thorne crawls toward the forward bulkhead door while the deck continues to tilt toward the bow at an increasing angle. He hears hydraulic fluid hissing from a severed line near the bulkhead door's operating lever. The forward bulkhead door swings shut under the force of the submarine's downward pitch, clicking the steel latch into the frame. Thorn grabs the steel dogging handle and pulls upward with his full weight. But the metal remains frozen in the locked position. Seawater begins to spray through a hairline fracture in the outer hull weld, striking the steel deck with a deafening roar. Thorn's fingers slip on the wet metal of the door handle as the water level reaches the tops of his leather boots. Senior Chief Miller maneuvers through the dark toward the center of the compartment, holding the Ace of Spades between his thumb and forefinger. Thorn kicks the base of the bulkhead door with his heel, but the steel structure does not move. The seawater level in the forward torpedo room of the Gato-class submarine reaches Thorn's waist, dragging his heavy wool trousers downward. Thorn lunges for the hydraulic bypass valve located on the port bulkhead to equalize the pressure against the jammed door. The valve wheel refuses to turn, its brass teeth locked by the deformation of the surrounding steel hull frames. Thorn's hands scramble against the submerged steel of the Mark 14 torpedo rack, seeking a grip as the submarine rolls 5 degrees to starboard. A fine mist of atomized seawater sprays from a pinhole leak in the high-pressure airline, coating Thorn's face in salt. Thorn gasps, inhaling the mist, which triggers a violent coughing fit against the steel torpedo rack. Senior Chief Miller grabs the collar of Thorn's life vest and pulls him upward toward the auxiliary oxygen manifold. Miller's other hand remains submerged, holding the Ace of Spades against the cold surface of the torpedo tube number 4 outer door. The emergency battle lantern flickers to life on the floor, casting a dim, yellow beam through the churning, murky water. Thorn stares at the light as the water in the forward torpedo room touches his chest. His pupils dilate. Thorn's teeth chatter. His jaw locks, then loosens again. Miller leans his head close to Thorn's ear and shouts a command over the roar of the seawater injection valve. Thorn stops struggling against the bulkhead door and turns his gaze toward Miller's illuminated face. Miller holds the Ace of Spades directly in the beam of the battle lantern, revealing the black ink of the suit symbol. "Look at the spade," Miller says, his voice vibrating through Thorn's damp shoulder against the steel bulkhead. Thorn focuses on the sharp point of the card's central icon, while the seawater level reaches the rim of the Mark 14 torpedo breach. Miller instructs Thorn to inhale for the count of 4, timing the breaths to the rhythmic ping of the enemy destroyer's active sonar. Thorn draws in a shallow breath, his lungs burning from the concentrated humidity and the smell of battery acid fumes. The hull of the Gato-class submarine groans again as the vessel descends past 250 feet on the internal depth gauge. Thorn exhales slowly, pushing the air through his pursed lips as the water level nears the emergency breathing manifold. Miller flips the card over, showing the white back against the gray paint of the forward torpedo room bulkhead. Thorn holds his gaze on the card. His shoulders stop moving. A heavy wrench falls from a high shelf and splashes into the water near the Mark 14 torpedo rack. Thorn remains still, refusing to break his gaze from the card, while the Gato-class hull continues to creak. Miller uses his free hand to tap a rhythmic beat against the steel casing of torpedo tube number 2. Thorn mimics the rhythm by tapping his own fingers against the wet fabric of his life vest. The internal air pressure in the forward torpedo room increases, causing Thorn's eardrums to pop with a sharp, painful sensation. Thorn swallows hard to equalize the pressure, his eyes never leaving the yellowed edges of the card against the steel bulkhead. Thorn grips the edge of the Mark 14 torpedo rack, while the rising seawater in the forward torpedo room reaches the base of his chin. Senior Chief Miller holds the water-stained Ace of Spades exactly 3 inches from Thorn's nose to fix his visual focal point. The enemy destroyer's active sonar strikes the pressure hull of the Gato-class submarine with a metallic clack that vibrates through Thorn's skull. Thorn inhales through his nose for a rigid 4 count. following the vertical movement of Miller's index finger along the card's edge. A jet of seawater from the ruptured overhead freshwater pipe hits the surface of the pool, creating a chaotic white foam around Thorn's neck. Thorn keeps his chin tilted upward to maintain a 1-inch air pocket between the water surface and the compartment's overhead steel framing. The internal depth gauge needle for the forward torpedo room vibrates violently as it settles at the 300 to 20-foot graduation mark. Miller taps the corner of the Ace of Spades against the steel bulkhead door to signal the start of the next measured exhale. Thorn releases his breath in a thin, controlled stream, avoiding the intake of the oily surface film now coating the water. The Gato-class submarine makes a low structural impact sound as the keel plates contact the silty seabed. Thorn's body jolts from the impact, sending a wave of salt water over his mouth and into his nasal passages. He spits out the seawater and immediately reestablishes his visual lock on the salt-stained spade symbol on the card. Miller's hand remains locked against the Mark 14 torpedo tube number 2 breech handle as the submarine settles firmly into the seabed. The frequency of the active sonar increases, striking the hull every 2 seconds with a sharp electronic resonance. A sonar strike hits the hull. Thorn exhales. Another strike. Thorn exhales again. A second high-pressure leak erupts from the packing gland of the number 1 torpedo tube outer door, spraying a horizontal fan of water. This new leak sprays directly into the glass lens of the battle lantern, causing the yellow light to flicker and shift. Thorn narrows his eyes to track the Ace of Spades through the spray and the failing illumination of the battery-powered lamp. Miller pulls a heavy brass flashlight from his belt and shines the beam laterally across the yellowing surface of the card. The light highlights the curled edges of the Ace of Spades where the seawater has soaked into the paper fibers and blurred the ink. Thorn reaches out with his left hand and places his fingertips on the bottom edge of the card to ground his body against the swaying water. The Gato-class submarine's electric motors hum in a low-frequency growl as the helmsman shifts the screws into full reverse. Thorn detects the vibration of the rotating propeller shafts through the steel bulkhead as the submarine pushes against the seabed silt. The pitch of the forward torpedo room shifts suddenly, causing the trapped water to surge toward the aft bulkhead door. Thorn loses his footing on the submerged, grease-covered deck plates and slides toward the number 3 torpedo tube assembly. Miller catches Thorn's life vest strap with a gloved hand and hauls him back into the center of the air pocket. The Ace of Spades slips from Miller's fingers during the movement and floats on the surface of the oily, dark water. Thorn lunges forward, submerging his face entirely to grasp the card before it drifts into the dark recesses of the bilge. He resurfaces, gasping for air, and holds the dripping, water-stained card up into the path of the flashlight beam. Miller nods once and points to the central spade icon, re-establishing the 4-count breathing rhythm. The sound of depth charge explosions becomes a dull, distant thud as the USS Harder gains sternway and lifts off the bottom. Thorn maintains the inhale count as the submarine's bow rises at a 15-degree angle, forcing the water level to shift again. The water level begins to recede from Thorn's chest toward his waist as the manifold for the forward trim pump engages. Thorn hears the high-pressure air rushing into the main ballast tanks, creating a thunderous roar that drowns out the sonar pings. He presses the Ace of Spades flat against his wet wool shirt to prevent the paper from tearing in the turbulent air currents. The Gato-class submarine levels out at a depth of 150 feet, and the audible straining of the pressure hull ceases. Miller takes the card back from Thorn and places it carefully into his buttoned breast pocket. Thorn slumps against the steel casing of the Mark 14 torpedo and exhales slowly, his lungs continuing the rhythmic cycle established by the card. He watches the remaining 6 inches of water swirl into the deck drains as the forward trim pump continues its mechanical whine. The hydraulic bulkhead door latch suddenly clicks and rotates as the damage control party opens the door from the outside. Senior Chief Miller pulls the water-stained Ace of Spades from his breast pocket as the USS Harder moors alongside the submarine tender in Midway. The card has dried into a warped, concave shape, its edges stiffened by the evaporation of the Sea of Japan brine. Miller hands the card to Thorne near the gangplank of the Gato-class submarine, his fingers brushing against Thorne's palm. Thorne takes the card and places it inside a protective plastic sleeve used for shipboard identification documents. He slides the sleeved card into the inner compartment of his standard-issue leather wallet. 3 weeks later, the USS Harder departs for its next combat patrol near the Philippine Islands. Thorne receives an assignment transfer to the engine room of a different Gato-class vessel, the USS Pompanito. He watches from the pier as the USS Harder clears the harbor breakwater and disappears below the horizon line. Thorne opens his wallet in the cramped confines of his new bunk to check the condition of the Ace of Spades. The card remains motionless in the plastic sleeve, the salt marks now appearing as faint, translucent rings on the paper. Reports arrive at the Submarine Command Headquarters regarding a heavy engagement between the USS Harder and a Japanese Kaiboken escort vessel. The communication log indicates the USS Harder failed to check in at its designated coordinates following a series of depth charge attacks. Thorne sits on his bunk on the USS Pompanito and removes the Ace of Spades from his wallet. He runs his index finger along the raised ink of the spade symbol. Following the contour of the printed lines, he observes the mechanical vibration of the engine room floor through the soles of his boots. Thorne maintains a 4-count breathing cycle while the USS Pompanito executes a practice dive in the training grounds. He reaches for a roll of adhesive tape in the tool locker to secure the card's plastic sleeve to the interior of his locker door. The card stays mounted there throughout the remainder of the 1945 Pacific Theater operations. Thorne cleans the exterior of the plastic sleeve every Sunday using a dry piece of cotton waste. He places the Ace of Spades alone in the wallet slot. The remaining cards stay in the locker. When the war concludes in August 1945, Thorne removes the card from the locker and places it back into his wallet. He carries the wallet through the discharge processing center and onto the civilian transport ship. The card's edges begin to fray further, losing small fragments of paper fiber each time the wallet is opened. Thorne applies a thin layer of clear lacquer to the edges of the card to prevent further structural degradation. He places the card into a wooden cigar box once he arrives at his residence in the United States. The box is stored in the top drawer of his nightstand, next to his service medals and a spare set of house keys. Thorne checks the room's humidity gauge at regular intervals. Back in the kitchen at 3:04 a.m., Thorne releases his grip on the chrome faucet handle, having stopped the water drip. He picks up the Ace of Spades from the Formica tabletop and holds it under the beam of a small LED flashlight. The tick-tock of the Howard Miller wall clock continues to pulse through the air of the silent kitchen. Thorne matches his inhalation to every second tock of the clock's mechanical pendulum. He moves to the kitchen counter and picks up a clean, dry microfiber cloth. He wipes a single stray drop of water from the laminate surface of the table where the card had been resting. Thorne opens the wooden cigar box and places the Ace of Spades back into its felt-lined compartment. He closes the lid, ensuring the brass latch clicks into the recessed strike plate. He walks to the kitchen window and pulls the cord of the Venetian blinds to close the slats. The plastic slats snap into place, blocking the external glare of the street lamp on the wet pavement outside. Thorne returns to the sink and places a heavy rubber stopper over the drain to prevent any rising sound from the pipes. He pauses beside the sink. Air leaves his nose. He reaches for the light switch on the wall and toggles the lever to the off position. Thorne navigates the dark kitchen without stumbling, his hands finding the back of the wooden chair with precision. He slides the chair under the table until the backrest is flush with the Formica edge. He stands in the darkness for 30 seconds. His breath does not change. Thorne turns and walks toward the hallway, his footsteps making no sound on the linoleum floor.